It's very good to be with you here this morning. I'd like to first begin by thanking Archbishop Socrates and take today and to be part of this wonderful event. This is now my third trip to the Philippines, and very much it's becoming part of my life and very much part of my family. And I'll be returning again in September. So unfortunately, I'm not as talented as Bishop Lafitte to be able to learn quickly. So maybe by September, I'll pick up some more of your language and be able to speak to you in some of your own native tongue. So again, it's good to be with you. Bishop Lafitte and our wonderful attorney, Liban, gave us a wonderful presentation on some of the things that we're confronted with in the world. And so before I move into my main talk, I'd like to just kind of give a little background about which has been around since 1972 as the Human Life Center, and eventually in the 1980s to become Human Life International, has a voice in this conversation concerning the dignity of human life. It is indeed our very mission. HLI was founded in 1981 as a continuation, as I mentioned, of the Human Life Center by Father Paul Marx. Father Marx was a Benedictine monk and a social scientist, and many times he used his PhD to get into the conversations with people who were not in promotion of human life or the dignity of the family, but he was able to infiltrate their conversations because he would go in as Dr. Marx, and it allowed him to learn what the peddlers of death were up to. And John Paul II, now St. John Paul II, referred to him as the apostle of life. And John Paul again said to him that you are doing the greatest and most important work on earth, an affirmation of the protection of the family and human life. Our mission is to defend the authentic God-given rights and dignity of all human persons from conception until natural death, and to promote the natural family through education, outreach, advocacy, and service. Human Life International is the largest Catholic pro-life and international pro-life missionary around the world, working in 6 continents to defend the sacredness of human life against governments and non-governmental agencies that consider unborn children and the natural family to be obstacles to progress and development, rather than resources for genuine progress and development. Human Life International's pro-life missionaries travel to organize, train, and equip pro-life leaders and organizations to defend their cultures against governments and organizations who promote an anti-life and anti-family agenda. We do this from the perspective of both faith and reason, based in the social and moral doctrine of the Church and using the latest empirical and social science. My family, the wealthy nations of the Northern Hemisphere, are promoting a culture of death in parts of the world, like here in the Philippines, that still value human life and value the dignity of family life. Their targets are mostly people of color, our brothers and sisters who still welcome children to life, respect their elders, care for the most vulnerable, and recognize the importance of the traditional family for true flourishing, with billions upon billions of dollars given annually and ironically in the name of development and aid. These nations, together with private NGOs, non-governmental organizations, destroy the most vulnerable, oppress the poor, harm women and families, and undermine traditional cultural values by imposing their corrupt agenda. Because Human Life International's history, its global outreach and experience, my intention with you this blessed day through this presentation is to shed some light on the threats the family faces. There are 2 things that I want to address, but I'm only going, because the time prevents, is address 1. But there are 2 distinctive threats, both mentioned by Bishop Lafitte and by other presenters over the last few days. The crisis of faith and the daily living out of that faith is one of those crises that our attorney friend just mentioned, Mr. Liben. The second is the one that I'm going to speak to us briefly about today, the threat of totalitarian tactics promoted by the state, some of which Bishop Lafitte has already made note of. Both of these pose an equal and menacing threat against the family. If I have time, maybe during our forum, we might speak of some of the faith-related issues. So let me begin by quoting the charter in the paragraph number 9. In paragraph number 9, it says, the family and marriage need to be defended and promoted not only by the state, but also by the whole of society. Both require the decisive commitment of every person, because it is starting from the family and marriage that a complete answer, underline, a complete answer, can be given to the challenges of the present and the risks of the future. Today, because of the weakening of the family, society is plagued by a host of violence against the sacredness of life, the evils from contraception, abortion, the rejection of parental rights, support of same-sex unions, chronic poverty, and the abandonment of society's care for the aged and the handicapped. These are just but a few. The well-being of the family, strained by the threats of secularism, relativism, individualism, and totalitarian tactics by overarching governmental policies and laws, is the starting point in any conversation about creating a vibrant, healthy society. If a family, a healthy society, hinges upon the health and vibrancy of the family, then we must defend and uphold the family, the traditional family, marriage between one man, one woman, open to the gift of sacred life, as established and created by God. My dear friends, we see a strong correlation here between countries that protect life and those that protect the family. Overall, the Holy See's recommendation in the Charter have been ignored by most countries and peoples. And the race is on to make abortion on demand completely available, to redefine marriage to include, at least for the moment, same-sex unions, and to completely replace traditional values and faith. This process has long been underway, beginning in Europe and expanding quickly to the United States, and now it is here at your own doors in Asia. We should note here that while governments can adopt policies that to some degree protect the family, the real work, as noted by St. John Paul II many times over in his pontificate, is at the work of the cultural level, in the culture, which both determines and is determined by politics. The wealthy nations and NGOs that are promoting the radical redefinition of rights and values have great access to governments, but they often are thwarted by people who don't want what they are marketing. Developing nations have been more resistant, I think, largely because they are not as media developed as of yet. So it takes longer to change hearts and minds in developing nations. These are places where the church, the Catholic Church, has a toehold, and where the church is still often leading the fight to protect the traditional family. In the Northern Hemisphere, it is about trying to recapture lost ground. This was noted by Bishop Lafitte. It is not easy once a law is passed or the influence of these agencies have changed hearts and minds to accept these realities. So what happens is it takes greater effort to defend. But this is what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere. And to preserve the dignity of the family. So it is a wonder that in many parts of the world where life is protected, marriage is protected, the sacredness of the family is protected, the church is not persecuted, that the values of the church and those values of the family and life flourish. It's when these other agencies are allowed in that we see the radical change. So let's talk about just for a moment the role of government. A government's first responsibility is to respect the most basic human rights of its citizens, seeking to serve and not to rule them. They must promote the family and protect the most vulnerable, while protecting the legitimate economic rights of the person, which leads to an investment and economic growth that has a more lasting and a more positive effect than government programs. Nations that get this well see true and sustained progress, and nations that do not will see little progress while continuing the struggle. Let me offer a few examples. China and certain other Asian nations have seen a large drop in poverty due to their encouragement of free markets, but some still retain an authoritarian government that does not respect human rights. China, for example, is ascendant now, it's growing, but will not be for long as the demographic consequences of its radically unjust one-child policy continues to develop. This is what happened to Japan, which showed such great promise in the 1980s. However, because the Japanese sadly do not have children and its fertility rate is one of the lowest in the world, they are stuck with a declining population and thus economic problems. Russia is also suffering a great decrease in population, so we shouldn't be surprised that its leadership is looking for ways to reverse the decline. In Russia, there are still 13 abortions, 1-3, for every 10 live births. The total fertility rate of Russian women hit a historic low in 1999 at 1.16. In the current day, the average is 2.25, already very low, but again, 1999, a very low rate. By 2012, it had climbed to 1.61, exceeding that of the European Union at 1.58, while Poland's and most of other East European nations range at an even lower range of 1.27 and 1.45. Not only Russia, but also Europe as a whole, together with other developed and developing nations, have a problem. Their populations continue to decline at an alarming rate. Mr. Vladimir Putin's assessment, putting all the political issues aside, his assessment of the problem in Russia is on the money. It is absolutely correct. He says that the real incentive to grow demographically has to come from a spiritual and moral rebirth. But for this to happen, people need the freedom to see and choose the truth. As I said, putting aside political issues, his assessment is on the money. This strategy would require freedom of religion, generous incentives to families to have children, protect human life from conception unto natural death, promote and sustain policies that allow for economic freedom and aggressively address and do not tolerate on any level governmental corruption and favoritism, while punishing those who break the law and abuse the rights and privileges entrusted to them by the people of God. Corruption is key to the continuation and breakdown of the society and the attack against the family. But without a populace that knows how to use its freedom, which is the church's speciality, she, the arbiter of that truth, helps in every way where she is free to exercise her mission. Governments cannot impose such a culture. It has to come from the hearts and minds of people who are free and know that their freedom requires virtue and community-based solutions to the human issues they face. So let's look at some of the sin and ideologies that are affecting the family. The UN and the EU seem focused on an anti-life and anti-family agenda through new, quote, human rights, end quote, that the gender identity theories and other policies aiming at reducing the population of the world. There is no doubt that we are facing an epic struggle between natural, divine law, and atheistic humanism. The radical gender ideology referenced by Bishop Lafitte and the destruction of authentic human rights go hand in hand and are consequences of a militant secularism that has overtaken our society and our institutions. I suppose you could go as far back as you want to find the origin of these social cancers. Ultimately, the source is the fall, which resulted in the original sin. With the church marginalized, there is increasingly no voice against sin. Social structures become built around sin, as the church has long recognized. Philosophically, you can go back to Descartes and his radical skepticism, separating faith from reason, leading to the lie that reason can purify itself and itself serve as the basis for society. Many thinkers accelerated this idea of Descartes, though I would say it culminated with Nietzsche's rejection of God, which became systematized by Marx. The rejection of God leads to the rejection of reason itself, and power is a matter of an act of will, supposedly beyond good and evil. Europe's 20th century is a testament to this line of thinking. With the wars and murderous totalitarian regimes, each rejected God and religion, each tried an alternative system, leaving tens of millions dead. Of course, these cultures of death consumed themselves, but for what has followed in their wake is a radical secularism that is so also atheistic, but is more subtle and cloaked in a language of human rights. Yet these rights are arbitrary, determined by the powers of the age, who are now telling us that your gender is not based on your physicality as a man or woman, but how you feel on a particular day. And I'm going to interject in this point. In Canada, you might recall recently where a law was passed where a child, can determine which bathroom, male or female, the child decides they want to go to that day. So, imagine if I walked into the woman's bathroom over here. You would have a fit, right, ladies? And if you don't, then we ought to start with that right now. There is a problem, and that all of society must recognize itself around this bizarrely anti-scientific, anti-rational, and anti-religious view. Radical gender ideology is essentially the ultimate power move, a rejection of the most obvious fact of our being, our given sexuality, in favor of an intellectual fashion and a demand that no one be allowed to question the new faith. It makes accusation of supposed Catholic teaching, forcing saying her opinion on others to look rather quaint by comparison. This will not end well, my dear family, so we must fight it with all that we have. So let's take a little look at this totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a term used to describe a political system in which the state holds total authority over the society and seeks to control all aspects of public and private life wherever possible. Again, let's consider the 20th century systems of the Stalinist Marxism in Russia or National Socialism in Germany as examples of totalitarianism. As stated by Benito Mussolini, quote, all within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, end quote. What some have called hard totalitarianism is easily identifiable, but there, my friends, is a stealthy or disguised totalitarianism at work in many governments and international organizations representing much more subtle mentalities which tend to enshrine, quote, democratic totalitarianism, end quote, or, quote, the totalitarian temptation, end quote. Could democracy become a thinly disguised totalitarianism? Are there already examples of democracies, democratic states, implementing totalitarian tactics? The answer is yes. Remember, no democratic nation has ever voted in by the majority of its people to legalize abortion. None. Legalized abortion is always imposed by totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, or by elites who manufacture court cases designed to reverse duly created laws that actually protect innocent human beings. The danger of authentic democracy degenerating into totalitarianism, I believe, was summed up the best by St. John Paul II in Centesimus Annus in 1991. It is a long quote, and I placed it here. I'll just read some of it. Authentic democracy is possible only in a state ruled by law and on the basis of a correct conception of the human person. It requires that the necessary conditions be present for the advancement both of the individual through education and formation in true ideals, and of the subjectivity of society through the creation of structures of participation and shared responsibility. I changed my mind. It's an important quote. Let's read the whole thing. Nowadays, there is a tendency to claim that agnosticism and skeptical relativism are the philosophy and the basic attitude which correspond to democratic forms of political life. Those who are convinced that they know the truth and firmly adhere to it are considered unreliable from a democratic point of view, since they do not accept the truth and that truth is determined by the majority, or that it is subject to variation according to different political trends. It must be observed in this regard that if there is no ultimate truth, underline, if there is no ultimate truth, objective truth, to guide and direct political activity, then ideas and convictions can easily be manipulated for reasons of power. As history demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. So let's look at a few. Time here, both governments and international organizations have an agenda that aims at the destruction of the traditional values of society, to promote abortion and contraception in all its different forms, to legalize euthanasia, to promote homosexuality as a legitimate alternative lifestyle. What is particularly concerning in our times, family, is that different governments that in the past were simply promoting, encouraging, thinly, softly, those immoral actions of which I just mentioned, now are aggressively seeking to impose them by force, even taking criminal action against those who disagree with their policies. As history reveals and teaches, what we need to understand is that this forced imposition of liberal ideology is part and parcel of the ideology. I'll start with the United States. The United States has had abortion with very few restrictions for over 3 decades. 56 million abortions and growing since 1973 in the United States. Yet the trend is definitely in the pro-life direction. At the state level, we have seen the adoption of over 40 different abortion-limiting laws, and last year alone saw the closure of more than 40 abortion clinics due to public safety laws. The U.S. government is still trying through its new health care law, the Affordable Health Care Act, to make it so that unwilling parties pay for abortion. But there is strong resistance to this, but yet it is still trying to force it upon the church. Europe, as you know, always a dynamic situation with individual governments and the EU, which has a pro-abortion slant to it. Still, there has been some strong resistance to the abortion agenda. The wonderful program, One of Us, is an example. This campaign was effective in rallying a wide base of support, restricting funding for the destruction of embryos at the EU level. Spain and Norway are looking at putting strong restrictions on abortion, and though we have to fight until not only every abortion is illegal, but also abortion becomes unthinkable in any instance. We welcome these small victories, and I see them around the world. In Africa, most nations have strong laws, though South Africa is one of the worst in the world. Enforcement of these laws can be a problem, but generally abortion is still rejected by most of society. Latin America, too, is under constant pressure through the Organization of American States, which is like the EU, but has less power. Wealthy non-governments and NGOs that want to make abortion more widely available. The only place where abortion is available, and only in this area, is in Mexico City. The other states within Mexico do not have the legalization of abortion. Abortion is somewhat available in Colombia and Uruguay, and to some degree in several other countries, but it is still generally frowned upon. There are strong cultural barriers to expanding abortion access, but their media is becoming Americanized. That is, being filled with US-based programs and Hollywood values, which are all in favor of sexual promiscuity and contraceptive mentality. So let me return to the US mandate. The United States is not a totalitarian state, but the totalitarian impulse is very thinly disguised, yet becoming more assertive and open. These signs should cause us grave concern. Consider the contraceptive mandate of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, what we often refer to as the HHS mandate. This mandate requires Catholic institutions to provide health care insurance of services that the Catholic Church believes are objectively evil. The HHS mandate involves government intrusion into the internal governance of religious institutions and threatens government coercion of religious people and groups, requiring them to violate their most deeply held convictions, to violate their moral conscience. We have to underline that the HHS mandate is an attack on religious freedom, which as a consequence entails a persecution of the Catholic Church and of all believers that disagree with the mandate. Francis Cardinal George, the Archbishop of Chicago, warns that the HHS contraceptive abortifacient mandate will close Catholic hospitals and universities or force them to secularize a process he calls, quote, a form of theft, end quote. If this regulation is not rescinded, the Catholic Church will, quote, be despoiled of her institutions, end quote. This serious attack on religious freedom and the right to formulate a conscientious objection was raised by Pope Francis at the audience that he granted to President Obama recently in March of this year. It should be noted that in the press release, that those press releases are usually negotiated between the government that's being represented and the Vatican, the Holy See, and the U.S. diplomats. So if you want to read what Pope Francis said, which was very challenging, the U.S. media picked up something different and couched it in a very different language, making it sound like the Holy Father really didn't say anything very strong to him. Read what the Holy Father said, and you'll find something quite different. Another set of cases that should be kept in mind are the persecution of Catholic institutions by the National Labor Relations Board. We have several instances when this same board tried to extend jurisdiction unto Catholic universities. These illegal actions have placed heavy burdens on many Catholic institutions. The board has taken action in the past against Manhattan College and St. Xavier University, which would have stripped these religious affiliated colleges of their federal labor law exemption for failing to meet with the board's definition of what constitutes a religious school. It is interesting to note that the United States Supreme Court, in an appeal in D.C., found that a school is exempt from this board and its policies if it holds itself out to students, faculty, and the community as providing a religious education. 2, it is organized as a nonprofit. 3, that it is affiliated with or owned, operated, or controlled directly or indirectly by a recognized religious organization. The Labor Board was extending its authority in an inappropriate manner, and the court saw that and recognized it. Now, I'm going to skip over France because Bishop Lafitte gave us some background on this, and our wonderful attorney spoke to you about the Philippines already. But let me turn to the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, there is a very serious concern that sexual education will become mandatory in all schools, and that the role of parents as primary educators of their children will be totally ignored. Many of the programs used in that country and imposed by the government have serious problems. These programs are too explicit in their content. Second, they promote sexual activity in early age. And third, they promote pornography. In London, new guidelines were published just this year in February by the Faculty of Sexual and Reproductive Health, a faculty of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecology. Under their guidelines, quote, doctors and nurses who have moral objection to prescribing contraceptives which act by killing human embryos are to be barred, listen, to be barred from receiving diplomas in sexual and reproductive health, even if they undertake the necessary training. This is happening around the world. In Canada, when I meet with physicians, many times I'm told that their licenses are being challenged by the state because they will not prescribe contraception, they will not perform abortion, they will not offer any, in a sense, of anything that is contrary to their religious belief or to the basic natural law. And as a result, I know one doctor recently whose license was removed from him. So the state is truly imposing itself and imposing its agenda. Many doctors of all faiths, and those not claiming any particular faith, have a moral objection to destroying human life and wish therefore to avoid using these things, but they are being imposed upon. Let's look at Germany. If we consider that parents are the primary educators of their children, and as a logical consequence, we should agree that they have the right to homeschool their children, regrettably few countries recognize this right. So I want you to think, for those of you here still raising your children, think about how you would feel if the Philippine government came in and decided that you were not going to teach your children those basic values and moral values, that they were going to do this. Or if you decided that if you wanted to teach your children at home in some kind of way, that you would be denied that freedom. Germany has outlawed it. The primary reason, it says, is to ensure that it does not lag behind other countries when it comes to the education of their youth. In a landmark court decision, it was decided that by parents homeschooling their children, they are depriving them of the social norms of society, and therefore it should be illegal, forcing every student to be taught by the German government. So this is what's happening. There's a recent case that I'd like to mention. It's called in the Romiki family case. They wanted asylum in the United States, and at first they were granted asylum, but that eventually would be overturned. They were denied. And basically they were denied because let me read the quote to you. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that the government's arguments for denying the family asylum reveal a philosophy that is hostile both to the homeschoolers and to religious liberty. So basically, this attack. In a separate case, a German judge stated his view against homeschooling, declaring, quote, the children would grow up in a parallel society without having learned to be integrated or to have a dialogue with those who think differently and facing them in a sense of practicing tolerance. So the government knows what's best for one's children. The United Nations. Now again, I'm just going to glance over this with you, but I think it's important that we see the picture of what we're dealing with around the world, that here maybe you are not necessarily dealing with as strongly, but it is here. On February 25th, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child issued a scathing report telling the Catholic Church to leave its outmoded sexual morality behind. When we analyze some of the glaring problems of this report, we can clearly perceive that the UN's statist, materialist, and anti-family ideology is radically at odds with the Christian worldview. The committee chastises the Catholic Church for supposedly ignoring or refusing the rights of children. it called for the church to amend its own juridic law, to change her unchangeable teaching, to embrace secular morality on matters ranging from homosexuality and contraception to abortion and gender ideology. This just happened in February. In paragraph 10 of this report, the church is told to avoid discrimination and protect the children's right to express their views in family matters. This indicates that the committee regards children as being radically separated from their family, particularly from their parents. This is very serious. This is the foundation of the gender ideology, the notion of the human person as a radically autonomous creature, a feature of modern humanistic philosophy that can also be seen in the new bioethics that holds autonomy to be the highest good, above even the right to life. At its core is an anthropology that assumes that the individual is utterly sovereign and that society is held together not by the kind of mutual ontological ties found in families, as we've heard in both presentations, but by the external force of the state and the pressure of the ideology behind the state. It is the state that defines the person and the family. Now, again, there are many examples that I could share from the people that I have the privilege of serving with around the world. And it is so amazing to me, family, that what, again, as Archbishop Lafitte spoke about, that 2 years ago, that he would never have thought that just a simple phrase that he would see in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, which I have seen many times over in my visits there, that would catch on so like fire. But it's so true. And what we can't do is take things for granted. We can't sit back and just be silent or think that it won't happen to us. Family, these things are happening gravely around the world. I'm going to draw this now, in a sense, to its close, but looking specifically at the human person. Again, using John Paul II's wonderful teaching in Sanctissimus Annus, he says, the root of modern totalitarianism is to be found in the denial of the transcendent dignity of the human person, who, as the visible image of the invisible God, is therefore by his very nature the subject of rights which no one may violate. No individual, no group, class, state, or nation, not even the majority of a social body may violate these rights by going against the minority, by isolating, oppressing, or exploiting it, or by attempting to annihilate it. Catechism of the Church states the human person is the only creature on earth that God has willed for himself. Genesis, we find the source of human dignity in sacred scripture. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. In the opening paragraph of the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, the Church states her case about the dignity of the human person as it relates to the personal and religious freedom of that individual. A sense of the dignity of the human person has been impressing itself more and more deeply on the conscience of contemporary man, and the demand is increasingly made that men should act on their own judgment, enjoying and making use of a responsible freedom, not driven by coercion, but motivated by a sense of duty. The demand is likewise made that constitutional limits should be set to the powers of government in order that there may be no encroachment on the rightful freedom of the person and associations. In order, family, to authentically redirect society from its perilous direction and transform it into a culture of life and a civilization of love, hearts must be changed. This can only be accomplished by God and through God. Through the importance of science and technology and the church teaching, they can serve crucial roles in the battle over life and family. The underlying component that must be reawakened in the lives of people around the world is faith. We are in a spiritual battle. For most in the world, faith is no longer important but perceived as passé. Science, technology, and man's own abilities are sufficient for life's dilemmas and resolutions. Self-sufficiency, autonomy. We have seen the fruit of such sad direction and the consequences resulting from the rejection of God. All we need to do is turn back the pages of history in the 20th century alone to experience one of history's most violent and murderous periods. It is a testimony to man's ability to self-destruct without truth outside himself guiding him, calling him, and giving him purpose and identity. In other words, man needs God. In Europe, Poland is the only nation to adopt very strong restrictions on abortion after decades of its legalization. Hungary has adopted a new constitution called the Easter Constitution. Ireland fell recently with a very deceptive campaign to legalize abortion, and Malta continues to weaken under the pressure not only to legalize abortion and its acceptance of divorce, along now with the push to accept same-sex unions. An element that we must consider in this conversation is the issue of faith and its positive influence in daily life and response in family life. When faith is central, the church is the key component, and the daily life and her teachings are integrated in the life of the community. There is life, joy, and peace. There is a healthy society. When faith is rejected and acceptance of immoral teachings become normative, the community begins to wither, and violence against the family prospers. What has aided the death peddlers, my dear friends, success in promoting their anti-life agenda is the breakdown in fully living faith and its adherence to the moral truth concerning life and family. In the absence of its guidance and protection, the faithful have become easy prey to the illusionary language utilized by the anti-life communities. The laity's knowledge of and adoption of church teaching on the family is woefully inadequate. They have not been taught, as noted by our friend Attorney Lieben. Thus, they are mostly incapable to adequately respond to the growing trend of secularization and the aggressive militant approach of the moral norms that we are facing in this world. I close by saying this, family. As the church begins to look towards October in the Synod on the Family, and joyfully and humbly, Human Life International was privileged by Archbishop Paglia, the president for the Pontifical Council for the Family, to participate in the questionnaire on 2 occasions to give a global picture of what HLI sees around the world. I commend the Holy Father for calling such a synod, and I pray that the issues that are affecting the family will truly be brought to the attention of the Universal Church. And I close with this, and I want to use the quote from John Paul, again, looking at how he looked out of the world. And I put it here. And it says, the culture and praxis of totalitarianism also involve a rejection of the church. The state or the party which claims to be able to lead history towards perfect goodness and which sets itself above all values cannot tolerate the affirmation of an objective criterion of good and evil beyond the will of those in power, since such a criterion in given circumstances could be used to judge their actions. This explains why totalitarianism attempts to destroy the church, or at least to reduce her to submission, making her an instrument of its own ideological apparatus. When the church is weak, families suffer. When the church is strong, families are strong. Society is strong. And the society and culture which we live in prospers. Again, thank you, Archbishop Villegas, for invitation, Bishop Reyes for your invitation, and God bless each of you.